If you want to build better paths, you have come to the right place. I've been focusing on my paths for a very long time, and I've managed to compile a few tips that have helped me improve my paths, and of course can help you improve your paths and your world overall. So how about we kick things off with a very simple idea that is going to make a huge difference to your paths, and that is getting rid of these edges that are so straight, and generally they actually are not helping you at all. So the idea is that the grass on the edge of the path will be growing over the path, and that is going to help you to break up the edges. So if you do something like this, you see on these edges, and just every now and then replace the block. It obviously depends on how much you want, but I normally do just once every few blocks like that. Make no rule, because if you make a rule, it starts showing up. So you're best off just kind of clicking wherever, and you get a little bit of the edges broken up. And of course, what you can do is also go another block in, for instance, there. And the blocks in the middle of your path, you probably don't want to do too many of, because of course the grass is spreading over your path. So if the grass is spreading over, it's most likely not going to just be a tuft in the middle of your path. So if you can do it, for instance, there, as if the grass is grown over, that helps you out a lot. Now, when we take a step back, you can see the path looks a little bit more broken up, but still not 100% of the way there. So a second part of this rule would be to just do a few bits on the edges. And of course, we had the grass growing over the path. And of course, if a path was being walked on, you would expect it to not be too straight. So of course, if you go one out every now and then like this, the path should start to merge in a little bit more with the land. And you can see sometimes taking a step back, you realize maybe a little bit over there. And what was a 3-wide path is still sort of a 3-wide path, just a little bit further out. So let's move on to the next tip. And this one has still got a lot to do with the shape of the path. And that is to go from this point to the other point with a little bit more style. And of course, we are still going to be breaking up these edges, but in a different way, which is going to work alongside what we've just learnt. And that is, we're going to make a little bit of a curve, maybe 1 or 2 blocks out on this path like this. So if we go out like this a little bit, and we end up taking the inside bit of this path in a little bit like this, you should see it start to look a little bit more interesting. So that's just 1 block. We'll go 2 blocks as well. But one tip that I have for this, and you'll see it'll all start to work in the end, is whatever you do on the outside of the path. So for instance, the path that is bigger, the side of the path that's a little bit bigger like this, the inside needs to be a bit smaller. So we'll be taking in a few blocks like that. And it's pretty easy to wrap your head around once you get it, but at first it might seem a bit weird, but it makes sense. Basically, the outside has to be larger than the inside. That's all you have to think about, and you'll eventually get it right. So right there, we've got a path, and if we take a step back, you can see maybe this one needs to go just a little bit more like that. And we should have a fairly good looking path very easily, just like that. And we still get from the same point to the next point, and that just makes it a little bit more interesting. So here's a bonus tip for doing this particular tip of moving these paths around things, and that is to make them move around something. So a path doesn't just curve for no reason. People are smart, you see. If you're walking from here to there, you're probably going to do it in a straight line and not just go off to the side and back again. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a reason for it going around there. And sometimes you don't need too much of a reason. A tree, for instance, just makes this look a little bit more realistic, why this path would be curving. And you'll see that all of a sudden, your paths start to make sense. Now you can do this, of course, if you're out in the woods or whatever. Trees make a good obstacle, but for instance, rocks, houses, you name it, you can put it in the way. Put a signpost, go around that. Something so simple like that will make a huge difference to your paths. And also, just to show that this does work, we can go ahead and do what we did in the first tip. We can just move a few things out like that. And all of a sudden, the path should start looking like 2 things are happening, and they are super simple, super easy. And the path now looks, I think, fairly good. Here's our next tip, and we are not going to be removing our path. We're going to be improving on the path that we've already got with those other ideas. And that is, we're going to add a little bit of texture. Not too much, just a little bit. And that's going to improve this path that next step above where it is. So a few things to think about when you're adding texture into paths are, for instance, blocks that tend to complement the path. For instance, something like this, like an oak log, which tends to work quite well with the tree, and you can maybe have it in like that, as if it was some roots growing there. And it also just adds a little bit of color to the ground, a little bit of texture to the ground. So just stuff like that. It doesn't even have to make sense as much as some of the other stuff. For instance, just having them on the ground makes a big difference. The other thing also, of course, stones like cobblestone and andesite, they don't really complement it too much color-wise, but you could, for instance, do something like that. Maybe grab a slab or something and make a little bit of a piece of the side, like a rock like that. That adds a lot more to it as well. Now, the real complementary sort of stuff comes when you're a bit further away from path block and maybe doing your own custom paths away from that. And what I would suggest is, for instance, if you were using path block and you wanted to do, for instance, this, you see how an oak block is fairly similar to the path. Say you wanted to put it in there. It doesn't work too well. And the reason for that is actually one of the coolest tips, but I would say use a slab. That makes a big difference. So just think about this. If you're using path blocks, slabs and normal blocks mean different things to you, and I will show you why. So this is a bonus tip on the whole idea of texturing your path, and it's not very important, but I would suggest keeping it in the back of your mind while you're making paths, because I'll tell you, a lot of people don't think about this, and they're missing out on some huge changes that they could do to their paths just for this little thing. And that is that path blocks change depending on what block is next to them. So if they've got a full block, for instance, a full oak plank block like that, they go a little bit darker. If they've got a path block or a transparent block like a slab, they don't. So that is a pretty cool idea to mess around with. For instance, you could do something like that and maybe something like that. And you can see that the blocks look a little bit different because, of course, they are different around the edges. It's just something to keep in mind. And the other part of this also is that it affects the blocks diagonally from it. So if I do another one like that, they should start to work a little bit more like that. So there's a lot of stuff to play around with. And if you have a look at just the path itself, it's got a lot more change to it. And that can help you get a darker block in or a lighter block in, depending on how you do it. So the idea of texturing your paths is super important just to get them looking a little bit more interesting than what they were before. And I would suggest just going ahead and trying so many different blocks together in a creative world and seeing what you can come up with, because a lot of these things are just subjective and you don't know what looks good until you put it together. So just play around with that and you'll eventually get some good ones. Of course, you can't go too wrong with your cobblestone and also your paths like this as a base, and try and work your way out from there. So here's our next tip, and this is going to tell you just how important texturing your path is, not only just to make it look more interesting, but also to hide a few of the imperfections in your path and a few of your mistakes. And in this one, this isn't actually a mistake, but it's more just what you're going to encounter eventually. And that is a step up from one block to another block. And really, you want to encounter these because a flat path is a very boring path. And of course, we can make it a little bit more interesting if we can step up. And having just a single block like this, it's not going to cut it. So what I'd suggest is using some of the blocks that you've used to texture your path that may have, for instance, a slab or a stair variant, and making a little bit of a mess as you step up. For instance, something like this, where we could go in with some cobblestone that we've already used. We can use a bit of a slab and a stair as well, just to make things a little bit more interesting. And also maybe just something like oak or spruce or something like that, which will work quite good. Spruce tends to work quite good when it's a bit darker like that. And what this will do is this will allow us to have a bit of a messy start over here to this top piece. But when you step back, it should start to look a little bit more interesting. So we'll just do maybe something like that. Something like that. In fact, we'll just merge them in a little bit better than what I've done before. Just like that. And of course, it takes a bit of trying and a bit of trialing out different ideas. But something like that could make a huge difference. In fact, we'll just do something like that over there. And also just always replace that block underneath when you're dealing with path blocks. Trust me, you got to do it. It just seems like you've missed something out that's huge when you don't do that. So there we go. Something along these lines. It all depends on what's going on around the place, but I think something like that will work most of the time. And of course, it hides the mess and also makes the step up look so much more interesting. So here's our next tip, and it's one we have all been guilty of, and we know we're meant to do it, but we just don't do it. And that is plan out your paths, plan out your builds, any build that it is, just plan it out. But for paths, it still remains the same. So say we wanted to go from here to the other side of these trees. We could go ahead and just place a block on either side of it like that, and we can work our way of our path. So of course, conveniently, these are in a straight line, just like what we did before. But this case, we are going to be building our path from scratch. I'd suggest using a block that's got a bit more color in it, but of course you don't always have a colorful block available. Normally I find maybe something like plain lapis blocks, because you tend to get a bit of that after your early game mining, and you tend to have quite a bit of it lying around. So if you have lapis, that could work quite well, but we're just going to use this blue block here, and we're going to just look at our path and maybe squiggle it around a little bit, you know? Make sure we got the path planning out this way. And the reason why we want this, and it's more important than what you might think, is of course when you're building your path, and you're building from block to block, you sometimes could find yourself placing down the blocks, going a little bit off course, realizing you're a little bit off, carrying on back on, and then your path ends up looking really silly. So just go and do the blocks, walk along with them, and you won't get lost in your path. Another good reason also to use colorful blocks is not just because you can see them really easily while you're building, but once you've built something, very often you forget your blocks. And I've done it many times where I've had a cobblestone block that's been sitting out of place for months, and I've just been missing it for ages, and really, you don't want that to happen. So always make sure you pick up your blocks, and of course, colorful blocks could help you out there. So we've got a good path laid out with some cobblestone blocks. This is very simple. This is just still the planning. And one tip that I have for this is something you may have noticed, and that is the fact that I'm going 3 wide on a lot of the paths. And the reason why 3 is a magical number is because it's an odd number, which is really great for building, and of course, just keep building with your odd numbers and you'll eventually figure out why. The other reason is, of course, 3 tends to stay within the scale of your Minecraft character, which is generally 2 blocks tall, so around that high. And a 3 wide path for a small path like this looks great. And of course, if you're going for more of maybe a city road, 5 blocks could work quite well. So what I'm doing here is I'm just laying out where I've got the basic part of the path, and I'm just putting out 2 blocks on either side there, just to make sure that I'm going 3 wide there. And now what I could do is I could texture this path. So I'm just going to make this path out of a different block, which is the stone. And the reason for that is a lot of people like stone, and I thought I may as well just show you guys what I do with it. And this is a tip for texturing, not necessarily for paths, but for a lot of things, is to start with your very rough block, which could be cobblestone, and work your way out from that. So maybe a slightly lower level one and a slightly lower level one to something very basic, and work your way around like that. And the other way you could do it is, of course, start very basic and then work your way up again. And I find that tends to help me out. So for instance, cobblestone, maybe some of those, maybe even just something a little bit less rough, maybe a bit of andesite in there, and then we can go on to some stone or something along those lines. And that could work quite well for a full path like that, even just some bricks and stuff randomly around there. So that's one tip of this. And the other part of this is also you could merge in 2 paths. For instance, this could be coming out of a city. We could be going into a woodland forest, and that could be where these paths end up connecting. So we could have a brick path merging in with the normal path block path. There they are, very simply merged, but it gives me one example of something that might show up every now and then, and that is a straight line in a diagonal like that. And that's something you really don't want because it's a pattern that repeats itself. So it's a cool little place where I could just give you a tip of maybe breaking it up by a block or 2 and making the path, for instance, be a little bit wider or whatever around there. And that just helps break the path up just that little bit more. So now that we got all that out the way, the last tip is one that is going to just come over time, and of course it's to do with all the builds around your paths, and that is to either build your paths around your builds or build your builds around your paths. And what I mean by that is really go ahead and think about what is going to be pushing your path. For instance, these trees like we have spoken about before, but for instance, like a little bit of a fence just to round the path off. And what you can do to think about this a bit better is, for instance, having a fence around your path means that while you're walking, you're not looking at the path to show where you're walking, you're looking at the next object, for instance, the fence there. Say, for instance, you had even just a whole bunch of stuff on the side like that. As you're walking, your eyes are already starting to look for the path before you have to go and think about the path. Whereas when it's just like this, it feels like it isn't really covered in. So for instance, even just some leaves for some bushes like that can help you out. And of course, just plain bone meal on the ground makes a huge difference just to get your path covered in. Of course, you would want it to your taste, but I don't like that much myself, but you can mess around with it. And of course, put a building, put maybe a cart, maybe something just to stage the area and have you walk through it without having to look down at it. And of course, have the path work in with the build. And it's not meant to be the most important part of your build per se, but it's meant to be something that you can look at and it looks nice and it complements the builds around it. So that's the most important part of the path. Of course, just let it work in with all your builds. So those are all the tips that I could think of that should help you improve your paths and take them to the next level. Now, if you've got any extra tips, of course, leave them in the comments section, but that will be me for today. So I hope this has helped you. I hope you've enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.